Welcome to the Collectability Podcast. Today, we are pleased to have the opportunity to interview Jaclyn Lee, a collector, intellectual, influencer, and someone incredibly knowledgeable about all things Patek Philippe. I first met Jaclyn in June 2020 when she emailed me out of the blue to ask about a two-tone cushion Patek Philippe I had on offer on my site. I quickly learned that Jaclyn is thoughtful, inquisitive, and quite creative in the way she builds her watch collection. She is wise beyond her years, in my opinion, and I think this podcast will offer our listeners insight into a brilliant collecting mind. Here is Jaclyn's official bio from the incredible Waiting List podcast, and more on that shortly. Having been fascinated by old things from an early age, Jaclyn is passionate about the world of mechanical watches, especially vintage watches. Her first watch was a Rolex 6234 Pre-Daytona, and since then, she's fallen head over heels over the idea of curation with intention. How one should focus less on finding watches, but more on the matching of meaning. Jaclyn is currently a student at Harvard studying economics and psychology. And aside from watches, she enjoys photography, traveling, reading, and playing with her cat, Luca. Jaclyn was born in China and raised in Canada. So welcome, Jaclyn.
Thank you for that intro. I have to admit, I forgot I wrote that intro, and I'm kind of proud of myself, but that sounded great.
You worded it brilliantly.
Thank you.
You are one of our youngest guests on the Collectability podcast, and I look forward to learning your insight into the world of collecting from your perspective, and even learn more from a generational perspective at how you look at collecting. To begin, I don't like these definitions, but are you a millennial? And what does that mean anyway?
I mean, I think on paper, definitely a millennial. But when we're talking about collecting circles, it's not something that I think it's a word that gets thrown out quite frequently around, just because you're dealing with collectors who are much older than you. And when you approach them, you have to, of course, be very humble with an attitude to learn. And the good thing and bad thing about social media is that you don't really know who the other person is, you're speaking to and what age they are. And once they find out, I've had instances where, many people think that I'm a European man who's in their 40s and 50s. And then it wasn't until a few months into the conversation, we exchange phone numbers, and then we even get on a call and they're like, whoa, I thought I was talking to a guy all this time. And then when they learn of my age, they're like, oh, that's very cool that you're into these things at an early age. I think it's, for me, I'm just, with an attitude to learn from people. And I feel like being young gives certain advantages and disadvantages at times.
And I wanted to ask more about that. What advantages does being young have, and what advantages does experience have?
I think one advantage, which I've learned to be an advantage over the past, few years, is just you have time to be patient and not rush into things. When I first started learning about vintage watches, and especially Patek Philippe, I think I was in a rush to want to touch and feel and wear a lot of these older watches. This was also during COVID when I was kind of stuck at home and didn't have access to people and network. Ever since COVID kind of soothed out, I started meeting more people in person, and I felt that it's more important for myself to just take things very slowly and examine things closely and not rush into things, because there's a lot of time to do that. One disadvantage would definitely be lack of experience. So in dealings with certain dealers or in certain transactions, not knowing enough people, there could be a lack of knowledge there.
I'm going to read something back that you shared on social media recently. You said, recently, I was told that I have the taste of an old man when it comes to watches. Not sure if they meant that as a compliment, but I certainly took it as one, end quote.
Yeah. That was for a photo of 1526. I was wearing that in central Boston, attending an event, and a collector came up to me and was like, oh, what are you wearing? And I showed him the watch, and he said, oh, that's beautiful, but I don't see you as someone who would enjoy that. That's like an old man's watch. Why do you like it? So then I gave him the spiel about how I acquired it, the story behind it, and why it's special to me. It was kind of like a joke. I certainly did take it as a compliment because I think when you wear certain watches out, even though we see many watches on social media, we don't see them as much in the wild, right? Walking
True.
down the street. And there's certain persona you relate to a person wearing a sport watch, a Nautilus, a Rolex. And then I think it's kind of fun when you don't expect a person to wear something that matches their appearance or age, per se. So it was a good conversation to have.
You bring such mindfulness to collecting, and I really respect that you're so thoughtful
I
about
try.
what pieces you bring into your collection. And in a way, during COVID, as you mentioned earlier,
Yeah.
that's when you first reached out to me.
Yes.
And out of the blue, you sent me this email asking about this two-tone watch. Can you, from your perspective,
Yeah.
remind or tell our listeners about what happened?
I remember that very, very clearly. It wasn't the first time that I've heard of you, of course, because I've watched videos of you showing your expertise online. But the first time I actually learned about your website was way before I started an Instagram account. And it was actually from a friend in South Korea who was keen on getting his first Aquanaut. And then he showed me your website. This was January of 2020. So I'm assuming it's about when
It's about the
Collectability
same
launched.
time. Yes.
And he learned about you and showed me on social media. And that's when I followed you on Instagram. So fast forward like 5-6 months later in the summer, I'm in Canada and I'm scrolling through Instagram and I see two people post one after another this photo of that watch on their story. And I quickly messaged them and I said, what is this? It looks so alternative. I've never seen anything like it before. And they said, oh, you should take a look at it. It's on John's website. So I went on your website again and I scrolled through the photos. And without learning, obviously, anything about the watch, the photos themselves was, what captivated me at first. And then when I read through the description of the watch, how it's, polished dial with the guilloche in the center and the engraved brigade numerals, I just loved it. And that's when I reached out to you. You were very helpful in helping me with all my questions because I talked about this in the podcast I have with my friends. When I first started, it was only Cartier, really, and a little bit of vintage Rolex. I was kind of intimidated by the name Patek Philippe because Long and I, we joked that we're not worthy of wearing a Patek. So I was waiting to find the one that really spoke to me. And on that fine day, that's what, really caught my eye. And that's when I reached out to you and we were able to make it work. I dropped it off at the Geneva Salon last November when I went. So it's in services right now. It's getting a complete service overhaul.
You might have it back in a year or two.
Actually, they told me might be a little bit longer than that because of the
Really?
age. Yeah, I think they asked me to do like more things with it, but I don't want to touch it. I just wanted the movement serviced.
I didn't realize this was your first Patek Philippe watch,
It
and
is.
it was from Collectability. That
Yeah.
means so much to me. Thank
Yeah.
you.
No, thank you.
And it's the watch that connected us. And then after that, in the fall of 2021,
Yes.
I had the pleasure of being interviewed by Daniel,
Yep.
Lung, and you. Chester wasn't part of that interview, unfortunately, as part of the Waiting List podcast. And if you're not already a subscriber to the Waiting List podcast, this is a must-listen series that covers a very wide spectrum of collecting. And I learned so much from listening, and I know our listeners would have such a pleasure if they haven't engaged with it already. As a guest of the podcast, this was one of the most enjoyable and I must say challenging interviews that I've ever done. And I say challenging in a very positive way.
Mm-hmm.
It was just the three of you were throwing questions at me I've just never even considered, and it was really opened my mind. So please take a listen to this podcast and start following the Waiting List podcast, and I'll post a link to that. But in this chat, you mentioned some of your worst buying regrets versus your worst selling regrets, which is a topic I find very interesting. Can you share your insight today on regrets in collecting?
I'll start off with the buying side. I think, again, because of COVID, I bought most things online. And when you buy things online, there's some hit or misses because you don't get to inspect a watch in person. So far, I have to say I've been quite lucky, knock on wood, that I haven't had much of an issue with the buying side. Most of the pieces, I'd say 99%, I'm very happy once I get it and I enjoy it. On the selling side, that's when things kind of get a little bit more vibrant. I do have some pieces that I, now looking back on, do regret selling. There were some, Lungays that I bought and I really enjoyed, but I have not a problem, but a thing I do where when I look at my watch box, I guess you can say a little bit of OCD. If things are just sitting there and I find them to be a little bit repetitive with something else that I have, my mind starts working and I start working out the math. Maybe I should let it go to get something else new that I haven't experienced before.
Of course.
And that's when, I let go of things and now, I regret on. But again, I think Tim Mosso said it very well in one of his interviews. I don't remember the exact wording of things, but he said, sometimes you have to fall out of love to fall in love with pieces.
Well said.
And that's what really stuck with me. And, I think once something is done, it's done. Don't think about it. Move on to the next thing. Yeah.
I think your words will resonate with almost all of our listeners. So how did you learn so much about watches? Was it from literally the internet at first? Take us back to the beginning, that first Rolex that you bought, and where did it all begin? And then where did you take it from there?
So it was winter of 2019. I've always had a passion for mechanical watches. None of these things are necessities, right? So growing up, it wasn't the case where, my grandpa and my dad were big watch collectors. My grandpa collected, ancient calligraphies. And my dad, he is very passionate about vintage Zippo lighters and World War II motorcycles and cars, especially motorcycles. So I remember he would pick me up in a motorcycle and I'd be so embarrassed because of the sound that it would make and everybody would be looking at me. So then I used to tell him, please, can you park on the road, down from the street so I walk to you? You don't have to come pick me up.
I'm imagining one of those sidecar motorcycles.
Yeah, that's exactly what it was. So I sit in the little seat on the
pod on the side. That's
exactly.
Fantastic.
Now it's cool, but then when I was in elementary school, I just thought it was so different, and my friends would look at me differently, what is that? But now, if he would pick me up, I would love to drive one of those.
That's much cooler than a school bus.
Yeah, I would say so. But yeah, I didn't come from a family of watch collectors. It wasn't until, when I got into college, my parents were very generous and they got me my first real watch that I would wear during college. And it was a sport Rolex. And I wore that everywhere. And it was so, useful. And I didn't think of having another watch because it did everything for me. Until the end of 2019, my mom was turning 50. And I wanted to, get her something nice. And she's also not a watch person. So I asked around and stumbled upon Patek Philippe and started doing my research, went into actually the Tiffany salon in New York, saw a annual calendar 4947G.
Oh, such a beautiful watch.
Yeah, with the silver brushed linen dial with the, kind of peacock blue strap, and ended up getting her that. But it wasn't, I made it sound very easy. It was a long thought process. Am I getting the right thing? Is she going to get most enjoyment out of it? My dad and I talked because it was a gift from both of us. But before buying that, I read through Cartier, Rolex, Vacheron, all the bigger brands that, most people would know about before landing on that watch. So after I got the watch and I gave it to her, I had a little bit of time wearing it around and I was like, this is really nice. This is very different from the sport Rolex that I had. And after I gave that to her, I thought to myself, maybe I should get myself one as well. But I gravitated towards vintage. I just like vintage more if I could choose. And because I had the Rolex for so long, I felt most safe and familiar with that. And that's why I went towards a vintage Rolex for my first watch. Yeah.
No, I have so many questions to follow up on that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, the question that I want to ask you is why Patek Philippe? Because most of my guests or most collectors I speak to, they tell a story about how like their father's father, like you referenced earlier, it goes back like generations. But here we're talking about something from 3 or 4 years ago where you methodically studied top brands, top offerings, and you chose a Patek Philippe. And I'm intrigued, and I bet our friends that work for Patek Philippe will listen to this too. Why Patek Philippe?
It's a long story. So
we have time.
Okay, so I'm going to take you way back. I think it was around 2014 when Hodinkee started their Talking Watches series, and one of the first ones they did was with John Mayer. And I never looked for watch content because I was in high school. I didn't have time to look at these things. But it just popped up on my feed one day and I, watched it. And I remember very closely the lineup of watches he brought. He brought some Rolex Daytonas and an Aquanaut with the Tiffany sign. And then he also brought a 5970G. And of the whole lineup, when I saw the 5970G, without knowing what it was, I love the look of it. I don't know why. It just stuck with me. So I went online and I looked up the specs. It was 40 millimeters. So I was like, that's pretty big. And that's when, during the interview, Ben Clymer said the 5970 and the 3970 are as good as it gets. So that's when I thought, oh, what's the 3970? So I look up online. It's basically the same watch, one generation before the 5970 in a smaller case size. So I thought to myself, that is what I want. Again, without knowing anything about the watch, the history of Patek perpetual calendars, the movement, Lemanian movement, I just loved how it looked. So when I came to the US for college, there was a shop in Boston. And I went in one day because I was on the street shopping for something. And I felt a little bit intimidated. I went in and I asked, by chance, do you have a 3970? Again, this was way before 2019. And the person there said, actually, we do. Give me 1 second. And he brought out a third series, now I remember, third series black dial 3970.
Nice.
And I put it on my wrist and it just felt so right. I'm wearing a 3970 right now. It's the watch that I feel is the perfect size for my wrist, perfect proportions. And I asked the price. He told me, I think back then it was around low 80s, high 70s, which we wish that was the case today, right? And I heard that, I'm like, oh, never gonna happen. But thank you for showing it to me. So that stuck with me. And again, I didn't know anything about the watch, just loved how it looked. So fast forward years later, I've always remembered the reference 3970. And when I first bought the two-tone cushion watch from you, that's when I started thinking, am I ready for this? Should I start looking for one? And even before then, I've had entertained and reached out to people like, would you consider as a partial trade my Pre-Daytona 6234 for a 3970? I reached out to them on Chrono 24, but this was during COVID. There was no way that I could ship the watches or bring the watches to Europe. So I never did that. And when I first got the Patek cushion piece, and I'm so grateful for it because I didn't get a 3970 as my first, even though that would be in some ways memorable, but in other ways, I'm kind of glad that I didn't because it eased me into it. And I really enjoyed the process of finding the perfect one that I wanted. So after that, I kind of, again, I felt intimidated. But then after my first Patek, I was hooked. And I started really reading about the history of Patek perpetual calendars. And then I read about the second series Platinum 3970, which, of course you read about the 2499 and there are only 2 Platinum 2499s made. Those are not possible. So I thought the second series 3970p looked pretty darn close.
Strong value
to the
proposition for sure.
Yeah. And I thought to myself, that's the one I wanted. But they only made a handful of those, maybe in the tens.
Did you find one?
And that's a story. But I ended up, after I would like to think that watch came to me because I wasn't looking for it, but I ended up finding one, and it took 6 months for that watch to be found, and it got lost in transport.
Oh no.
But then it came back.
It was discovered. Okay, good.
So yeah.
So you mentioned second series 3970, and I think I read about this. You commented on social media. Do you prefer the solid back with the 3970? Is it because of the thickness or the aesthetic?
I mean, obviously, for me, if I could choose, I would prefer a see-through movement, especially for Lamania movements, right? But for the thinness of a solid back, I think it's the best to wear. So, but I don't wear that watch enough because of the story, how it got lost in transport for a month plus, and I had given up all hope in finding it, and then it came back. So it's like my little baby, and I look at it and I wear it a little time sometimes, and I put it back. So it's a very special piece for me.
Sounds like the horological gods were smiling upon you that day when it was when it reappeared.
It was, I remember I went to pick it up and I didn't even open it for the first few days because I couldn't believe that it was found. Basically, it was lost in one of the big shipping centers. That was a nightmare.
That is so frightening.
Yeah.
I think we've all been there.
Especially for that watch because it was found full set in almost new stock condition. And I know that it would be extremely difficult to find that again. So that's when they emailed me. I had already given up a little bit. That's why when the trace agent emailed me on Friday, I didn't even see that email until Monday. So I gave her a call. I said, I'm so sorry. I missed your email. Did you say that you found it? So
that is the best news ever. I'm so glad that watch found its way.
Yeah. It's so vivid in my mind, that memory.
Now, do you consider yourself as an influencer and a tastemaker in the world of watches?
No.
Oh, but you are.
It's very kind of you to say, but I really, when I started this account, it was because a friend told me, why don't you start an account if you're scared of reaching out to people? Asking questions from my private account, which, is more friends, travel, lifestyle. And that's the whole reason why I started my watch account, which was to reach out to people, ask questions, and connect. So never do I consider myself a tastemaker or influencer. So it's very kind of you to say.
And for our listeners, please follow on Instagram at a.dose.of.time. No, it's a.dose.of.time.
Yeah.
And I think when you follow Jacqueline, you're going to learn more about her aesthetic, what drives her as a collector. And I love your short, clever commentary. You often play with words. Some people do. I feel like I'm reading a blog post with hundreds of words, but you don't do that. You might have one or two sentences and connect that watch to what interests you. And even your commentary on other brands is fascinating to me because although I'm focused on Patek Philippe, I like to hear what people say about other brands. And you have interest in Cartier, F. Journe, Audemars Piguet, of course, Lange, and one that pops to mind is you were discussing a Moritz Grossman
Yeah.
and how you call it a, quote, a grape soft drink.
Yeah.
Please explain.
So the story of the Moritz Grossman actually relates to Patek Philippe a little bit, because one of the pieces that I've been chasing after was a 2526G. Overall, I love 2526s. For me, I prefer white metal when I can. It's just more understated, and that's what I like to wear. But I love the softness of the double baked enamel dial. So when I approached Moritz Grossman to make a custom order, I asked for that colored kind of Grunfe enamel. And because MG is known for their hand polished, fired kind of violet red hands, I asked for plum indices to match those hands, kind of stay consistent with the whole theme. And one day I was just looking at it and taking some photos, and it really reminded me of one of those cream soda drinks you can get in Japan. Because of the creaminess of the dial plus the purple plum indices and hands. So when I was taking a photo, I was just like, I just put out what I was thinking in my head. I don't put much thought into it. Whatever comes to my mind, I write it down. But I think also I don't want to bore people with a long paragraph. I have written some long captions on posts that really, draw close to my heart and with interesting stories. So I like to share that. I wrote a long paragraph on the watch that that I bought from you, and then another one on the 1526. I think that's about it. Yeah.
But not only are your captions authentic, your photography is authentic. It's meticulously shot, and often with context, almost with like a feeling of landscape. And especially many of your earlier posts connected to like rocks and natural landscapes.
Yeah.
Can you comment on like the context of what you shoot? And then I'd love to know more about how you have mastered macro photography.
So I've been interested in photography since junior high, because I was in national debate at the time, and I would travel with my team. And every time I traveled, I would, shoot nature landscapes. That's what draws close to me. And I've always been interested by ceramics, like Japanese ceramics and whatnot. And I do ceramics myself at school. So I've been taking lessons there. And when I started photographing watches, it felt familiar to photographing ceramics, because I would take photos of the pieces that I make. That's why you see some landscapes on my page. It's what, I like and makes me comfortable for my eyes to see. When I started my page, the reason why it's called A Dose of Time, the whole idea was not a page that I don't want a page that's very watch heavy, like it makes your brain hurt when you're reading the comments or whatnot. I want it to be as pleasant of a viewing experience as possible. The content is watches, but I see it as more of a creative outlet for my photography. So that's why with the placement of certain things, how I play with natural lighting, when there is natural lighting, I don't use artificial lighting, that gives me opportunities and flexibilities to play with angles and shots.
You've captured something very special with your photography. When you look at some of the side profiles, you almost make the cases look like landscapes. I don't know if you do that on purpose, but I could see the connection with your appreciation of natural beauty.
Really, I've never heard of that before, but that's very kind of you to say.
Keep doing it. It's absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, with vintage watches, you've mentioned some important references. I'd like to throw out a few reference numbers that I think are in your collection, and would love your insight and commentary.
Of course.
Let's talk about the 1526 to begin. Why do you love the 1526?
Where to begin? My holy grail would be a 1518. I love how unique design the 1518 has. And just given the timeline of when it was made, the historical timeline, I think that's impressive. But to find one is,
especially in great condition.
In great condition,
yes.
Not to mention how much they are now, is out of reach. So in a similar vein, I feel like the 1526 doesn't get as much of a spotlight as the 1518 when it has similar kind of Calatrava case styles, cleaner, dial design with the big moon phase, which I love. And it was the first perpetual calendar made in series by Patek. Of course, it's one of the most beautiful watches that I've seen, especially when I was able to have it in hand and examine it. I love that watch. And I've been looking for one. I remember I even texted you one time, but then you had one and then it belonged to another client where it was already allocated. So I've always been trying to look for one in pink gold, actually. But of course, those are much rarer to find. And they only made one steel, right? So I know that my odds were going to probably be in yellow gold, which I'm fine with. And earlier last year, I was able to find one in full set condition with original receipt, original invoice, envelope, box. And when I saw it online, I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to go try and go for it. And if it's meant to be, it will work out. If it's not meant to be, I won't try harder, because I think that's something that, people can do during auction and they tend to regret later. So I was on the phone bidding on that watch, and I could see in the screen, because I'm also watching it live, that there are a few people raising their paddles, and I thought, okay, one more. And then when I tried it with my last bid, I was like, fingers crossed, please. And it ended up working out. So I was very elated when that happened. I think market price point, it was quite high for 1526, but in my mind, it's very worth it, given the story. I knew that it came with the original set, but I didn't know who the person was. I didn't know what their name was until I received it. And then I remember seeing the gentleman's name written, hand printed, and I reached out to Charlie, who's, very good with research.
This is Charlie Dunn.
Yes.
Who works with Eric Wind.
Yes. Who's also, we both know.
He's just wonderful.
He's the guy that posted the cushion case on his story. He's one of the guys. And I messaged Charlie and was like, where's this watch? He said, reach out to John. But anyways, I reached out to Charlie. I said, Charlie, I know, because he's mentioned on our podcast that he looks through old newspaper archives. I said, Charlie, I just got this watch. Any chance you could help me in researching who this gentleman was? So lo and behold, he sends me certain screenshots and said, hey, this guy's name is this. He works for the International Monetary Fund. He was based in Switzerland. We found even a letter signed by him 2 weeks prior to the date of the purchase.
That's fantastic.
And he was in Switzerland, stationed there at the time.
Wow.
So that was one of the longer blog posts I wrote, because everything just came together. I've always been attracted to old things. So I felt like I was reaching back. And I don't know how it would have worked. Maybe he walked in and the watch was there, or he picked it out of the catalog. Who would know, right? But it just adds that sense of mysteriousness and curiosity. And it feeds the child in me to know that, oh, there is this guy who owned it. And what I really like about that watch is the discussion it brought. So if you look at the comment section, someone said, it's very cool that the watch came as a whole package. And clearly the condition of the watch, he didn't wear it a lot because the case is still very strong, though, you can see some polishing marks. But what made him sell it, and yet over all these years, 75 years later, it still stayed together? We would never know. But I remember I made that post exactly 75 years after the original date of sale in June.
You bring up a great point. For collectors, we love having the whole package. And the reason is it gives comfort. Like when Charlie found that the gentleman was stationed in Geneva, it just ties all the loose ends, helps us connect to the past and know that what we're looking at is something true, something authentic. And yes, every watch has a history. Every vintage watch, it might have been polished. Often dials are restored. There's always some footnotes to history. And we, as collectors are trying to find as many of those notes as possible and make sure everything's consistent. We just want to get to the truth.
I mean, you do that on your videos on YouTube. I remember one of my favorite videos that you did was the backpack watch. That was something else.
Fun.
Yeah.
And trying to piece together the history was a beautiful challenge.
Yeah, but you did. And then you also did one on the Henry Graves box.
Just the box. I don't have the watch, but I have the box.
One day. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a forensic investigation and bringing up Eric and Charlie again. These are two of the best in the business of digging deep, finding the story, and sharing it with the world. I should note we are in Miami recording at a beautiful studio, and it is an amazing time because currently is the Miami Beach Original Antique Show. And it is something that I think most collectors must put on the to-do list to see. Now, I know you were there yesterday. What was your experience of day one at the show?
Well, thanks to you, I didn't know this was happening. My family, we just decided to come to Miami for Chinese New Year. We made the plans, and then we were talking, and then you said, hey, you should go to this show. That's when I knew about it. So I loved it the first day. It's tiring because of the scale of how big the show is, but I saw some really cool pieces that were exhibited at the show. When you're able to touch and hold these things and ask the person who's responsible of selling them or keeping them the story of how they acquired it, I don't know, you can get lost in there. I went with my family, and my mom kept on, was like, we have to go. We have to go, because she wanted to take a look at the jewelry, but I was just spending a lot of time in the watch booths. Yeah.
One of the most fun things about the shows is it's pure treasure hunting.
Yeah.
Because this particular show, it's antique dealers, watch dealers, and jewelry dealers. So you get a lot of random things thrown in.
Yeah.
So some of the highlights of pieces I saw, amazing 130 yellow gold Tiffany dial, beautiful condition. Yeah. So when you find something like that, your eyes just pop. But in a couple cases over, I found it was about 60, 70 years old, an 18 karat gold peanut. It looked like a peanut. You open it up and it was a lighter. Now, this is the last thing on earth that I need, but I'm absolutely intrigued by these quirky things that brilliant minds have made before us.
Yeah.
And yes, there are some modern watches there. Vintage is what I'm really looking for.
Yes.
And I can't wait to go back today because there are still some treasures to be found.
Yes, but this is what I'm struggling with. How do you even look at things when your eyes are just being pulled in all sorts of directions? You really have to be in a very calm state of mind to look through the booths and find things. Or else it's easy to get very, very distracted and lost.
There are hundreds of booths. I checked my step count yesterday.
Yeah.
I ended up walking 8.5 miles at the Miami Beach Convention Center. And I think I looked at easily hundreds of watches closely, maybe walked by thousands of watches. But how do you do it? Everyone has their own methodology. I like to start on one particular side and go to every different booth, try to get in early. The earlier, the better. The most interesting days at any of these shows are the first day, the first few hours, and then the last day, the last hours when people are willing to negotiate.
I see.
And it's such a pleasure.
Are you staying until the last day?
Yes, I'll be here to the last. Try to vacuum up some pieces at the end. But it's heartbreaking when you go back and you have your eye on a piece, and then of course it just sold.
Really?
And it's gone. And it is also just a circus of the human experience watching people negotiate.
Yes.
The nonsense that you hear. But,
really?
I mean, it's just the classic sellers and buyers,
Mm-hmm.
and the collision of that basic fundamental tradition of selling, and it's fun to watch.
Mm-hmm.
So
I bet.
it's a feast for the senses. So
Yeah.
that's my commercial for the show. So regarding modern watches, do you have some favorite modern Patek Philippe references? And I'll start that question, kick
Sure.
that question off by asking, what is the definition of a modern watch for you?
I think for me, it's when Patek started signing their movements, double P.
Mm-hmm.
That's my definition.
That's interesting. So you're the first person I've heard.
What have you heard?
I mean, I always go by like 20 years.
Okay.
I always go 20 years back, but I know that's like such a loose definition.
That's about right. I would say like the early mid 2000s. Yeah.
That's intriguing to me. And before, I would always say 1989 and earlier is vintage, because that's a very easy cutoff.
Yeah.
But you're looking at it being a relatively newer collector. Like, you look back at 20 years ago as a very long time ago. So,
I think 20 years ago is the neo vintage era. So not really vintage, but you can kind of get away with it.
Now, do you feel the 1990s are truly vintage?
I think neo vintage.
Neo vintage.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at the fashion world where 1990s is all that. Everyone's looking at the 1990s, where I look back at vintage as like 40s, 50s, 60s,
Yep,
70s.
yep.
All of a sudden, I'm hearing younger people say, oh, no, 90s is old school. And you see it with fashion. You see it with clothing.
True.
Now we're seeing, I just saw a piece on CNN on vintage phones, the flip phone.
Those are vintage.
That's vintage, then, oh my goodness. But I think it's very interesting that your division is the PP seal.
That's how
like that.
I've looked at things. But I also really like the 1989 cutoff.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very easy, 175th.
Over time, there'll be specific definitions that we as the collecting community will give to these eras.
Is it the 175th or 150th? 150th, right? 1989 is the 150th anniversary. Yeah. Right.
Now we're all looking forward to, and it's not long from now, 2039 is the 200th anniversary.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Patek Philippe is making plans for something extraordinary.
We will see.
For the 200th year anniversary.
Yeah.
So, current production. Do you have any favorites in the current Patek Philippe line?
I think there are some that I really, really like, but it's just the size of things. I can't really wear some of the modern pieces. So, I mean, to look at it, I like the 5270 again, but the size is, I feel like, too big for me. I was in Geneva in November, and I got the chance to, look at their showcase of the new models. Really liked, and this is what I did not expect. I really, really liked the rainbow aquanaut chronograph. Yes. And I did not
expect... It shows well in person so much better than in the pictures.
It does. And that was a surprise. I also really liked the 7118. And again, I don't have bracelet watches, but that watch in person, the size was great. I also saw the 5231G, which before seeing it in person, I always prefer the yellow gold. I just think it makes the cloisonné much more vibrant. Seeing it in white gold, it also made sense. And then I heard a minute repeater, 5078. That was another really good memory.
Is a minute repeater in your future?
If I could get them from Patek, but I know that it's like a very intense interview process, and then you need to be vouched by people and everything. So
how do you think Patek Philippe is doing as a company connecting with new collectors that just want to buy their first Patek Philippe watch from retail? Do you think they're doing a good job? And this is like a global answer, because are there different markets that might do a better job, in your opinion?
So I can only speak from what I've experienced. Whenever I go to the Geneva Salon, I've asked them, can I buy as someone who's a non-resident in Switzerland? And the answer is no. But I know for a fact that non-residents have bought from the Geneva Salon. So I'm not sure how that works out or what is the cutoff line or if it's, a gray area. I was always advised to deal locally with an authorized dealer, which in Boston, I think there's just only one. They're opening up another one soon this summer. So I think that will be very helpful for me to, again, touch the pieces and inquire. But I'm from Canada. And in Vancouver, there is also a Patek Philippe authorized dealer. Yeah, there's only one, but then I was going to say I wasn't going to call out the name, but there is only one. But I did go in to inquire, and they wouldn't sell anything to me. Their answer was, yes, we can register your interest, but it would help if you bought this and this and this. And they were also joined venture with Jules. So they asked me if I were interested in jewelry, which I'm not really interested. So I never really followed up with that.
I hear about this so often, this culture of pay to play to get a Patek Philippe with retailers. I'm not mentioning specific retailers, but some names come up more often than others, where they're like, oh, how about this diamond? And then maybe we could look at this this Aquanaut. And it's shocking to me. I really wonder how the brand positions their opinion on this with retailers. Back when I worked at Patek Philippe, I never heard of such a thing.
Yeah.
It was really a time where a Patek Philippe was sold to a retail customer. Now things have changed in this crazy world. I'm truly hoping in this downturn, and we don't even know the scale of this downturn at this point, but it is becoming more of a buyer's market. That hasn't reached the Patek Philippe retail mentality yet. I wonder if it will. And I wonder that someday you'll be able to actually go shopping to buy the watch of your dreams.
Yeah. I also don't know how and or when that will happen. But ever since coming back to Boston, I've spoken with some retail people from other brands. And I've asked them the same question. And they said, you have to also gauge from our perspective. For us to know a client well or know exactly what you want, to trust you, I guess is also very difficult just because of the sheer volume people they deal with. So for them to offer you a watch, there comes with a certain amount of trust. So
now, as a woman, do you think that sellers treat you differently? And this is retailers, dealers, or even other collectors.
I think depends on how you look at it. Whenever I walk into a boutique, let's say when I'm traveling or on vacation, and I go in to an authorized retailer, and they usually guide me towards, the 34 millimeter oysters or the 28. And then they ask me, oh, are you shopping for yourself or for someone else? I say for myself. But then if, they take the time and I take the time, we exchange information and share, then they're like, oh, okay, so you're not interested in those. You're interested in something else. Let me show you. I don't see it as a problem because we as human beings exchange via pattern and judgment. So I don't see it as an issue. Via dealers, in my experience, I feel like they tend to take care of me a little bit because I think more because of my age, and I tell them I'm quite new into this. So please don't be bothered if I ask you a lot of questions and be patient. And most of them are. The area becomes a little gray with online community because they don't know who you are behind your handle. And I know that there's like an active community of women collectors who are being very vocal online about, don't treat us any different than guys, which I think is great. And they do a lot of that in that area. But I was asked this question a few months ago. I forget how they phrased it. I think it was also, do you think there's any disadvantage with being a woman in this collecting field? And my answer was, I don't think so if you didn't differentiate between women collectors and men collectors. But of course, people do differentiate. So whenever I approach it, I don't even think of that. I just approach everyone the same as how I would approach non-collectors with dealers or collectors. So far, it's been good. I do have to say, though, there is this flare of like additional attention that is given to women collectors. And that I don't know if it's good for myself, because I don't really like to gather that much attention. So that's from my perspective. But I know of people who that's worked out great for them and they've launched new careers from. So
Now, you study psychology and also economics, but let's talk about psychology. Is there anything you've learned at school that you bring to the collecting world, whether negotiation or whether even with your economics background, understanding supply and demand? I could only imagine, because you think about watches all the time.
yeah,
I'm sure of that when you're in school listening to a lecture, are you connecting the dots of how you could bring that to your collecting universe?
very good question. I've never thought of it in that way. Obviously, the supply and demand you have to think about before inquiring about a watch. Go online, see how many of the same watch is being offered, compare the prices, write that to the dealer and say, hey, found this for lower. What do you think? Psychology, I study a very general, like psych. We do criminal psychology.
Oh, wow.
We also do child psychology and social psych.
All three could work in the dealer world for you.
I guess depending on who you ask and how you look
depending
at
on who
it.
you're working with.
Yeah, but I think what I learned from my own approach is I'm quite impatient sometimes, and I just have to take it back a notch. I have to remind myself, hey, sometimes when you pretend to be not very interested, it might work in your favor, but who knows? Depends on who you're talking to. Yeah.
It's
But you take that risk.
yes.
If you're like, I could take it or leave it. And they're like, okay. And you're like, wait a minute. Then you don't look very good, right? But I am a little bit impatient sometimes. So I try to be more calm in dealing with people. Yeah.
I think the subject matter that you're studying will serve you well in your life in the world of collecting.
Criminal
patience, criminal psychology. It's just so fascinating. We're in the people business, ultimately. As a collector, you're in the people business, and there'll be certain sellers and collectors that will be lifelong friends, and there are others that will not. I mean, it's just a fact of life.
Yeah.
And sometimes I find, from a psychological perspective, if I have a problem with another dealer or with a client, and it's how you work through that problem, often those people become very close friends when you see their worst side, or they might see my worst side, and then you work through it together. So
if you work through things.
Yes.
There
if you
are also
don't,
instances
then it's just
you
the
don't.
end of the story.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. I could talk to you for hours, but we're in the final stretch now.
Yeah.
I would like to talk about collecting in China. I know you have some friends in China that collect, and I'd love your thoughts on what you're hearing from collectors based in China today, and how the collecting scene is evolving.
That's a great question. So I can divide the collectors in China that I talk to into two subcategories. There is the collectors who are older and they've been collecting for a long time. They're very much into pocket watches, clocks, grandfather clocks, and chiming clocks and all that. And then those are just into getting into wristwatches. And then there is the other subcategory of newer collectors who's been into the hobby for, let's say, give or take, less than 10 years, with a lot of them being in the very recent development of COVID, period. So 2, 3, 4 years. And they only focus on wristwatches. What I can say is there, in my opinion, knowledgeable collectors, there aren't that many in China as compared to the West. But there are a few who are extremely knowledgeable, but most of them have studied in the West before going back to China. So I think knowledge-wise, there is somewhat of a gap to fill in China. But those who can speak English, they're very curious and they're hungry for knowledge. And those are the people who are buying more vintage pieces from auctions and whatnot. And they're very passionate. When they buy everything. So I know of a few individual collectors who have, I mean, I've never been, because I haven't been back to China and visit them, but I have seen photos of friends who have gone to their homes, and it's like a museum with the best vintage Pateks that reside in that collection. So I think there's a lot of potential for vintage in the Chinese market, even though most the big percentage right now is still catered towards modern. But I feel like for those people who are into it for the historical aspect and the stories, they definitely buy more vintage.
It comes down to trust, too.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Japan.
Yeah.
What are you hearing from the collecting scene in Japan today?
I think the Japanese market is also very interesting to look at. I don't know many Japanese collectors, but I think when Japan and Japanese collectors are mentioned, people think of quality. And I think that's what China is going to become with time, because the collecting circle in Japan, I think, is very mature compared to China. So that could be like a good comparison. I think with time, people will gather more knowledge, and then they will only collect like the tip notch for quality. I just feel like there's so much to learn from Japanese culture. It's one of my favorite places to travel to. Whenever I go through small towns that have 1,000-year-old kilns, ceramics, and the attention to detail they pay to life, work, friends, everything, collecting. I think not even Chinese collectors, but everyone can learn from them.
There's no coincidence that the next Patek Philippe Grand exhibition will be held in Japan, I believe in this June of 2023.
I didn't know that.
Yes, so they just announced it. So I hope to get over there. I think the Singapore exhibition was amazing. New York was incredible. And no doubt Tokyo will be memorable. But from what you just said, I think there might be some lines out the door, too, to get in and see some of these pieces.
Yeah.
It's so global. That's what's so fantastic.
Yeah.
And it gives me a great idea for other podcasts. We could literally go region by region. What's happening in South America is incredible.
Do you see a pattern of regionally people are interested in more specific things?
It's like you see markets just wake up. When I was at auction in the late 1990s, we saw China wake up, and it just changed. It literally changed the industry seemingly overnight. In especially as we were selling at that time more modern watches than ever before. There's going to be a lot more interest out of India in the very near future.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if it could be like what we saw in China 20 years ago. Probably not as big, I wouldn't imagine, but anything is possible. But what I love is, thanks to the internet, thanks for the ability to like use Google Translate.
Yeah.
People are sharing information so quickly.
Yeah.
And they're engaging and contacting in ways I've never seen before. Every day I wake up and my inbox is full from countries from around the world, from new collectors that are very, very serious. So it's exciting to see how things are changing.
For sure.
Segue to Canada.
Oh, sure.
Because we talked about Canada a bit earlier. And back when I worked for Henry Stern Agency, I went to Calgary, I went to Vancouver, a couple times to Montreal to to visit the Patek Philippe ADs, and it was a fascinating landscape at that time. And there's a lot of great vintage watches up there, by the way. But even though it's so close to the United States, it's amazing that I think the collecting community is very separate in Canada from the United States, from what I've seen.
I agree.
Share some insight, better.
I think I've never been to Toronto to connect with collectors. I know that there's quite a large community in Toronto, but from what I've seen in Vancouver, maybe it's because it's a young city with a lot of young people. People tend to only wear modern, and very few that I know of are in that mindset to collect vintage. So there is somewhat of a disconnect, and you can't really find that many watch stores that would carry pieces that we would see in the States. So it is interesting. I even thought about, trying to find vintage watches in Vancouver, because I feel like, if there's not many people looking for them, maybe could find some interesting, ones. And there are like 2 watchmakers that I go to, and they have some cool pocket watches, but they're just sitting there. Nobody's really taking an interest in them. I would see them every time I go.
I love finding vintage watches with Birks dials. Birks being one of the leading retailers, and they're out there. There's some really fantastic pieces that are continuing to surface.
I remember I saw like a large Patek with the Birks signature that I think you sent in for reservice, and that took like 2 years or something incredible like that, with the large enamel numerals.
I think it was a reference 11 or one of the.
I think so. It was on the site when I bought the cushion case. That's why I remember.
Such a great watch.
Yeah.
Now, from your Instagram, without a doubt, you put a ton of attention on straps.
Yeah.
And in a recent waiting list podcast, you asked the question, if I could wear just one strap for the rest of your life, what would it look like? Can you answer that question again for our listeners? And I would love your opinion on the perfect strap for a vintage Patek Philippe.
We did some fun stuff for the strap thing that we put out, because we get asked that question all the time, like, where do you get your strap? For me, if you look at what I put my my watches on, I think there's a general theme. I remember I went into a collecting gathering, and I opened up my box, and they're like, "Oh, you put the same strap on all your watches." And I take a look. They're not the same, but
they're close.
They're very close. I just have a thing for very, taupe brown, kind of earthy colored strap. I think it looks great, and I'm not one to always dress up my watches. I wear them very casually. So the one that I designed, to answer the question if I could wear just one, I designed this, taupe colored textured calf strap with contrasting stitching in off-white with like a moss green on the other side, to kind of like give a nod to nature and my appreciation for landscapes and nature. I think it would look great on, for example, like a vintage Calatrava. And that's actually the watch that I designed that strap for the first time. This was, I think, a year ago. And I kind of revisited that when we did this project. But that strap, I think, would look great on any like yellow gold, rose gold, white metal, maybe more white metal, because that's what I have most in my collection. But if I were to say like the perfect strap for a vintage Patek, first of all, when I think vintage Patek, I think yellow gold, right? And I love how tan brown looks like on yellow gold. Not dark brown, because I think that's too aggressive, that's too dull. I love kind of like a bright tan, and that will eventually pick up patina. So that's the strap I put on some of like my vintage pieces, even like on Cartier. I just think they look so good. So,
are there any other accessories besides watches I hate to call watches accessories, but is there anything else that that you collect that you have the same passion for?
I collect gems, so like not jewels, but I collect minerals and ceramics that I make, but then I also buy from other artists, and then analog cameras. That's my next obsession. Yeah, I've been trying to shoot with film for a little bit, and it's tedious process because during COVID I was processing them myself. I learned how to do that. Now I don't really remember, but I want to get back into that and shoot more with film and both digital. Yeah.
You need to write a book someday. I could just picture a coffee table book of your photography. It deserves to be printed large format. So
that's very
I'm
nice
challenging
of you
you.
to say.
That would be amazing. So
I'm always open to other creative ways to shoot macro, but given my apartment in the US, I don't have that much space, and natural light is limited in Boston these days. So I definitely want to, get out more. I brought some watches to Miami. I want to take some shots of. Yeah.
Well, Jacqueline, thank you so much for your time today. We covered a wide breadth of topics. And is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners before you go today?
Not much. I think we covered a lot. And just to say thank you for inviting me. I didn't think that I would come here and have this discussion with you, but it turned out great. And I'm so glad that we get to meet after 2 years and chat in person. Thank you for all the help and advice that you've provided me. And maybe we can have Lung or Daniel or other people come on next time.
Next time would be fun. We'd all get them
in a studio.
Everyone here.
Yeah.
We get them to Miami. It would be fun.
I know.
So it'd be really, really a pleasure.
I know.
You can follow Jacqueline on Instagram at a.dose.of.time. And I want to thank our listeners so much for joining us on this 22nd podcast in our Collectability series. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe so that you do not miss any future episodes. This is John Reardon for Collectability.